After World War II, the threat that the Soviet Union was going to spread communism throughout the world was something that scared Americans. And Americans did have reason to be concerned. The Soviets had given money and supplies to Communist China during the Chinese Civil War. Mao Zedong, he had led Communist China into victory in 1949. So Americans were concerned about what the relationship was between the Soviets and China and the goal of spreading communism. After World War II, the threat that the Soviet Union was going to spread communism worldwide was something that scared Americans. Americans had reason to believe that this was a possibility because the Soviet Union had helped China during the Chinese Civil War by providing them with money and supplies. The leader of China at the time, Mao Zedong, had led Communist China into victory in 1949, which caused China to become communist altogether. So it is something that was concerning to Americans at this time. During this time, there were two nations in the world that were trying to spread communism. That was the Soviet Union and China. At this point, Joseph Stalin, who was the leader and dictator of the Soviet Union, and Mao Zedong ruled Communist China for 27 years, were working together to continue to meet the goal they had, which was to spread communism all over the world. Another concern that Americans had was the development of nuclear weapons by these communist countries. In 1949, the Soviets had built their first atomic bomb. It was similar to the one that the United States had dropped on Japan in Nagasaki and Hiroshima after World War II. This could destroy an entire city. The United States did not want the Soviet military to be stronger than the US military. This was the start of making bigger and more powerful nuclear weapons, which what we call the nuclear arms race. So you might wonder, what exactly is nuclear war? Well, when you're talking about nuclear war, you're talking about using powerful nuclear weapons to fight. These are nuclear weapons that can destroy all life on Earth. This threat being out there in limbo and Americans not knowing if somebody was actually going to attack using nuclear weapons led them to create bomb shelters and to store food and supplies. When they created these bomb shelters, many families went out and dug ditches out in their yards and built underground shelters that would protect them from any kind of radiation or nuclear weapon destruction that might come their way. They also stored lots of food, mainly non-perishable foods, a lot of canned foods and things that they could use in case they were stuck underground for months at a time in the event that a nuclear weapon were to be used. As a result of the spread of communism and the fear that it had embedded in Americans, there was a new movement that was created. It was called the anti-communism movement. This was designed to stop the spread of communism and those communist ideas that many had. In the 1950s, there was fear that communism was going to spread to the United States. Senator Joseph McCarthy, he was an anti-communist who believed that there were communist spies working in the United States government as well as in other sectors of American society. These so-called spies were working for the Soviet Union. Some, but not all, of his claims actually came to be true. The fear that Joseph McCarthy put into Americans about communists infiltrating the United States became known as the Red Scare. There were many members of Congress who were against communism and began searching for spies or traitors that had actually infiltrated the United States government. Many government employees were questioned and ended up losing their jobs. Of those that were questioned and lost their jobs, only a few were actually found guilty of being spies. This impacted people's day-to-day lives, and their reputations were harmed. There were also actors and teachers and writers that were accused of supporting communist ideas, and therefore they also lost their jobs. If you remember back to World War II, at the end of World War II, the United States and the Allies had worked together to create the United Nations. That organization was designed to keep peace in the world. By 1945, there were over 50 nations that had joined the UN. They had challenges that they were faced with. One of them was that Korea was divided in two. South Korea, and North Korea. North Korea was a communist dictator country as opposed to South Korea, who was running on a republic government. Considering that the United Nations wanted to keep peace, having new wars being fought where they were actually fighting on the ground with weapons and destruction was something they wanted to try to avoid. This was difficult to do when we were also trying to stop communism from spreading. As I mentioned earlier, North Korea was a communist country. The communist government was led by a dictator. They received support from the Soviet Union to invade South Korea in 1950. North Korean wanted the entire country of Korea to become communist. They were trying to spread communism into the South. The southern area of Korea, or South Korea, on the other hand, was a republic. That means their society, their members, their citizens were able to have more say in how the government was being run, similar to a democracy. They received support from the United States. Since we wanted communism to not spread, we offered our support to many countries who had the fear or the threat of communism coming into their country. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. They did this at the 38th parallel. So if you look at the picture, you see there's a line between the red and the blue. That is the 38th parallel. If you look at a globe, longitude and latitude lines, you can find where North Korea and South Korea lie. At that parallel, they were trying to fight. The United Nations defended South Korea. 16 nations sent soldiers to fight for South Korea. Those 16 nations that sent soldiers were part of the United Nations, who had agreed to try to maintain peace and stop the spread of communism. Who was General Douglas MacArthur? Well, if you remember, General Douglas MacArthur was an American general that commanded the Southwest Pacific in World War II. He helped in the Philippines after Japan had attacked the United States. During the Cold War, he led soldiers from the 16 nations into South Korea to fight against North Koreans and keep them from spreading communism into the South. Although his mission was successful in moving North Korea back, he did not anticipate or expect that Communist China was going to help or provide support to the North Koreans. This made it difficult and made the war last a bit longer. The Korean War ended in 1953 when both sides agreed to stop fighting. Since neither side won in the war and they both agreed to stop the fighting, it ended in a stalemate. North and South Korea remain divided on the 38th parallel, still today. Thousands of American soldiers died during the Korean War, along with thousands of Allied forces soldiers that went in to help and support South Korea. So not only were we concerned about communism spreading in Europe and Asia, that wasn't the only problem Americans faced. We had a bigger problem closer to the home front, where the United States had to worry about the communism that was happening in Cuba. This Cuban island was located 90 miles from the southeastern point of the United States, or from Key West. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a revolution in Cuba against the government. At the time, the government leader was Batista. When Fidel Castro won this revolution, he joined forces with the Soviet Union, whose leader was now Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev helped Castro to set up his communist government in Cuba. And along with helping him to set up his communist government, he had other plans in mind. During this time, there were thousands of Cuban exiles living in America. They had escaped the Cuban government and Fidel Castro's regime. 1,400 of those Cuban exiles decided to come together and on April 17, 1961, launched what became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Their plan was to join American forces and go and fight for their country. The idea was that the CIA and Eisenhower would develop a plan to invade Cuba. These exiles, they would be trained as military. They would be getting the support of the military from the United States to show them how to fight and to prepare them for battle. The United States military would also provide air support. The goal, overthrow Castro, get him out of the government and establish their own government, which would be non-communist and more democratic. However, on February 1961, when President Kennedy authorized the order of the invasion, he chose to keep it a secret. He did not want the United States support to be something that the Cuban government would be aware of. The Cuban government did find out, and as a result, Kennedy canceled the airstrike at the last minute, leaving 1,400 Cuban exiles on Cuban soil, ready to fight with no air support. As a result, those 1,400 Cuban exiles either lost their lives or became prisoners of war and were arrested in Cuban jails. If you remember, I mentioned how Nikita Khrushchev was working with Castro to help him to develop a communist government. As part of this deal, Castro agreed to allow Nikita Khrushchev to put missiles in Cuba, missiles that were large enough to hold nuclear weapons. In October of 1962, the United States found out that the Soviets were hiding these missiles in Cuba. This was a great concern for American citizens and for the American government. Why? Well, Cuba is only 90 miles south of the United States, so any weapons that were being put in Cuba could easily reach the United States and impact Americans. John F. Kennedy, who was our president at the time, was afraid that the Soviets and Cuba would attack the United States. As a result, he ordered a blockade of Cuba. This meant that American warships surrounded the island to prevent Soviet ships from entering into the Cuban harbor. Once John F. Kennedy had ordered the blockade, his expectation was that the Soviets would remove their missiles from the island. However, this was not the case. The Soviet Union refused to take their missiles out of Cuba. It made the possibility of nuclear war more probable or more possible. Finally, Khrushchev decided to remove the missiles as long as the United States promised not to attack Cuba. This conflict became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the crisis was over, the two countries agreed to work together to prevent a nuclear war.